My name is Simone Tosi. I am a professor at the University of Torino in Italy, where I teach beekeeping and biodiversity and management of pollinators, and where I also coordinate the Bee Lab, a research group that investigates the behavior and the health of pollinators, especially bees. While at the University of Torino, we focus on many different aspects of bee behavior and bee health, including the amazing behavior the bees has, like the abilities of queen bees to sing, or the courtship and reproduction behavior of bees. We also do a lot of research on the reasons why these behaviors are impacted and why bee populations are in decline, mostly focusing on the impact of pesticides, as in terms of lethal and sublethal effects, but not just pesticides, because bees are exposed to many different stressors in the environment, such as malnutrition, climate change, pathogens. And so we studied them in interaction with all these realistic impacts. And I've done a lot of research on these topics. From the exposure side, we've been using bees and their service, their ecosystem service, to monitor environmental contamination. And so we figure out how widespread is the contamination of pesticides, and especially by multiple pesticides at the same time. And this contamination, how that impacts bees, but also many other organisms, including humans. We've also done a lot of research in terms of the toxicity of these products, of these pesticides, and especially in terms of the behavioral impact that they have. Not just the impact on the behavior of bees, but also the impact in the long term. We've demonstrated that short exposures that are typically included in the risk assessment are not as predictive of the impact as longer exposures that are still highly realistic. We've also studied the impact of stressors in combination. For example, we demonstrated that pesticides in combination with malnutrition cause synergistic effects. Of course, we studied the synergistic effects caused by multiple pesticides at the same time. And I want to mention that these are extremely relevant effects, because bees in the field are exposed to many different stressors at the same time, and we always focus on field realistic exposures. We've studied in terms of the impaired behaviors that are caused by pesticide exposure, the reproduction, a key aspect of the health of bees, and that allows the population to grow. We've demonstrated just last year that the very peculiar and interesting courtship behavior and mating behavior that bees have. In this specific case, we've been studying wild bees, are impacted by pesticides. For example, we showed that a field realistic exposure increases the duration of the mating process, but also at the same time reduces the sperm quantity and the ability of bees to courtship, to try to manage to have a successful reproduction, so just pesticides at the end reduce the abilities of bees to reproduce. We've also been studying the contamination of pesticides at a wider scale in terms of regulations. We've been publishing in a couple of years ago a paper on the emergency authorization, one of the first ones to investigate more deeply about the impacts of this process in terms of what types of pesticides are authorized as an emergency, and we show that they're widely more toxic than those that are typically used. And we also showed some weaknesses in the regulation, so that many of these pesticides that are authorized through emergency regulations have been authorized for a longer period than it was acceptable by the law. A few years ago, we have been focusing on a few neonicotinoids that were the most widely spread pesticides in the globe. and we demonstrated for the first time their impact on the flight behavior of bees. We demonstrated their impact on the locomotion and on the phototaxis of bees, showing that even field realistic levels of exposure can lead to important alteration of the behavior of bees. Of course, as you know, flight is a crucial behavior that allows the pollination and the reproduction of fruits and plants. And even if the bee is still alive, if this bee cannot fly or they fly in a way that's not efficient, of course, there is an impact at the level of their health, of course, the health of the colony, in case of honeybees or bumblebees that are social organisms, but also in terms of agricultural production, and finally at the level of their society. So the behavior of bees is extremely important, that we have to protect them. And so we've shown effects on these behaviors. After neonicotinoid, we've been focusing on the new generation of pesticides after the neonicotinoid use have been restricted, such as flupiradifurone and sulfoxaflor. We've been one of the first groups testing the adverse effect of flupiradifurone. It's important to mention that we started testing this compound to assess if it could have adverse effect on bees, and we indeed demonstrated adverse effect on bees, while this pesticide was still defined as bee safe. So it was still be able to use it in the fields while flowers were blooming, for example, and when you could see active foraging of bees. So it was quite important and we're quite proud to be providing more information on this topic, on the adverse effects that these supposedly bee-safe pesticides have on bees and on pollinators. Pesticides have been developed and produced and commercialized because of their widespread use in our current agricultural system, and they indeed have many benefits for agriculture, at least in the short term. They, however, carry many adverse effects, and it feels that the progress in developing new pesticides and new compounds, new chemicals, new molecules that are more efficient and more selective is not being balanced by the same amount of effort and energy and investments in figuring out what are the adverse effects of these compounds. In particular, it's been shown, it's pretty clear from history that starting from Ruther Carson, when in the 60s she published Silent Spring about the adverse effect of the widespread use of DDT. In the more recent times, the similar process have been also demonstrated for new generation of pesticides. One important example is the neonicotinoids, which have been authorized and then restricted or banned in many countries. They are still used somewhere in the world, of course, for example, in the US, but in Europe, for example, the regulations are more strict. And after neonicotinoids, also new other generations of compounds, for example, flupiradifurone, a pesticide that we have been studying, that now is restricted, its use is restricted in certain European countries. Indeed, as I mentioned, the progress of developing new pesticides is pretty fast and efficient, but it must be aligned with an assessment of their adverse effects. That's why the risk assessments are in place. The risk assessment goal is to figure out if the positive and negative effects of compounds are acceptable or not. The problem is that to assess these effects, especially the adverse effect, it's a pretty complicated topic. And especially the current regulations use guidelines and guidances that are not as refined and updated as needed in terms of what researchers have found in terms of effects of these compounds. For example, these regulations, these protocols do still not include widely and appropriately the impact of compounds on the behavior of the bees. So the focus is on the lethality, so if a bee is alive or not. But as we mentioned before, it's very important to figure out if an alive bee is also able to perform and to provide, for example, ecosystem services and to make the colony survive. They also marginally address the chronic effects. With our monitoring studies, where we investigate the contamination in the environment and in the beehives, we found out that, and not just us, like many other researchers in the world, we found out that the contamination in the environment is very widespread in time, so throughout the season and the years. So bees are exposed to pesticides for long periods, and this has to be tested, while risk assessment procedures so far are focusing on the short term. Furthermore, this exposure that bees receive is not just limited to one stress or one pesticide at a time. They are exposed to multiple pesticides simultaneously. And the issue here is that this combined exposure can lead to synergistic effects. The effect of one pesticide is extremely amplified by the presence of another one. So if they were alone, this pesticide would maybe not cause so much effect, but when they're together, the impact is much more riskful. And this is not implemented nor assessed in the risk assessment process, but not just for bees, also in general in risk assessments, because on one side, it's pretty complicated to assess these effects. But indeed, it could not assessing these effects can lead to a wide underestimation of the risks. Furthermore, while we have been focusing in this talk about pesticides, we have to mention that there are many other stressors that bees are facing. For example, malnutrition. Bees are widely exposed to malnutrition because agricultural fields more often provide food for just brief periods of time. The biodiversity and availability of nectar and pollen is reduced. And one of our studies demonstrated that there is a synergy between malnutrition and pesticide exposure at field realistic levels. So if a bee is malnourished, it is widely more susceptible to the intoxication by pesticides. And these complex contexts where bees are exposed to many different stressors at the same time, that is pretty realistic and common. Also, us as human beings, we are constantly exposed to contaminants and to multiple stressors at the same time. This is not really captured in risk assessment, and it can lead to an underestimation of the risks that the production of pesticides, the use of pesticides, can cause to us, but also especially to bees and pollinators in this case. Our lab, as well as various other labs in the world, have developed protocols and experiments that are able to test different types of behaviors of bees. On our side, we know the complexity of risk assessment, as I've been collaborating for a long time in this field with also EFSA and other agencies that are focusing on improving risk assessment. And we know the complexities of implementing behavioral studies, for example, in the risk assessment. That's why we're developing ring tests, which is a test that is developed at the same time by many countries and laboratories around the world to standardize these methodologies. So there's effort and there is interest to standardize behavioral studies and other types of studies that can be implemented in risk assessment. It's important to make this successful and to make regulation and the production and use of pesticides as protective for bees and the environment, that there is an effort also from the member states and the political effort to make sure that this field is growing and is producing what is needed, so that the risk assessment can be refined and improved and protect also the behavior of bees, not just their survival.